In 1837, during renovations at the Temple of Dendera in Egypt, engineers recorded an unusual phenomenon. Specific chambers intensified low-frequency sound in ways that resisted simple architectural explanation. Similar remarks surface sporadically in travel journals, colonial surveys, and early archaeological notes, often mentioned briefly and then left without follow-up. Across continents, ancient stone temples, subterranean chambers, and monumental halls demonstrate acoustic behaviors that appear deliberate rather than accidental. These spaces resonate, vibrate, or subtly transform sound in ways modern visitors still experience, yet struggle to explain through decorative or purely ceremonial logic. What stands out is not only the presence of these effects, but their quiet withdrawal from formal records. In many cases, structures were altered, sealed, or repurposed before systematic acoustic study could occur. Acoustic control is not a minor feature. It implies mathematical planning, material awareness, and knowledge of wave behavior capable of influencing human perception and physiology. If such systems were intentionally designed and later neutralized or forgotten, this raises a question reaching beyond architecture and history.
I began with the accepted explanation for ancient temples, because any investigation must first understand what is officially believed. In mainstream archaeology, temples are interpreted primarily as ritual, religious, or ceremonial spaces. Their layouts are explained through symbolism, procession, and visual alignment, rather than technical function. Sound, when mentioned at all, is usually treated as an incidental byproduct of stone, scale, and enclosed geometry. In this framework, acoustics are framed as accidental. Echoes are attributed to thick walls. Reverberation is described as an atmospheric enhancement to chanting or prayer. Any unusual auditory sensation is folded into spiritual experience rather than examined as evidence of design. I noticed that this assumption appears early in academic literature and is rarely challenged afterward. Most textbooks emphasize iconography, inscriptions, and orientation towards celestial events. Columns are decoded symbolically. Reliefs are read as mythological narratives. Measurements are discussed in terms of aesthetics or ritual proportion, not engineering performance. When temples are compared across regions, the focus remains on belief systems, not physical behavior. I examined several excavation reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries. When acoustics were mentioned, they appeared in footnotes or descriptive asides. A chamber was said to carry sound well or produce a strong echo. Then the text moved on. No instruments were deployed, no frequencies were measured. The implication was that such effects required no explanation. The accepted narrative also assumes limited technical intent. Ancient builders are credited with impressive craftsmanship, yet their knowledge is portrayed as compartmentalized. Mathematics explains alignment. Astronomy explains orientation. Religion explains everything else. Sound is left untheorized, as though it occupied no deliberate role. This framing creates a boundary. By defining temples strictly as symbolic spaces, any functional interpretation becomes unnecessary. If a wall amplifies sound, it is poetic. If a chamber vibrates, it is mystical. The possibility that these effects were engineered is not directly refuted, it is simply excluded. I noticed how language reinforces this exclusion. Words like incidental, atmospheric, and ceremonial recur. They close inquiry rather than open it. Once acoustics are categorized as symbolic, investigation stops. This does not mean the official explanation is fabricated. It is coherent and supported by visible evidence. Temples were undoubtedly religious centers. Ritual mattered. Symbolism mattered. However, the framework leaves little room for parallel functions operating beneath the surface. I also found that restoration guides and museum placards reinforce this perspective. Visitors are directed towards myth, dynasty, and ritual sequence, not towards material performance. Sound is experienced but unnamed. When guides clap or speak to demonstrate echo, it is treated as a curiosity rather than a clue. This interpretive habit matters because it shapes what questions are considered acceptable. By the time modern researchers arrive, the conceptual boundaries are already in place. Acoustics have been classified as secondary, and secondary features rarely receive primary investigation. The official story therefore functions less as an answer and more as a filter, quietly determining what can be seen before any deeper inquiry begins. I moved next to the anomalies themselves because they challenge the decorative explanation without immediately replacing it. Across multiple sites, I found references to acoustic behaviors that do not align comfortably with ornament or ritual symbolism. These are not vague impressions, but repeatable effects described by engineers, researchers, and visitors separated by geography and time. In certain chambers, sound does not simply echo, it intensifies its specific frequencies while remaining muted at others. Low tones may swell unnaturally, while higher sounds diminish or vanish. This selectivity matters. Random stone enclosures tend to amplify broadly, not precisely. Yet reports describe narrow ranges of resonance that appear stable and predictable. I examined corridors where footsteps fade after only a few meters, despite solid stone construction. In other passages, a whisper at one end arrives clearly at the other, while loud speech dissipates. These behaviors contradict basic expectations of distance and reflection. They are not easily explained by wall thickness alone. Some rooms are described as inducing physical sensation rather than auditory clarity. Visitors report chest vibration, pressure in the head, or a feeling of imbalance when sustained sound is produced. These reactions occur without visible mechanical devices. They appear linked to spatial geometry, material density, and enclosure ratios.
What stood out was how often these effects were dismissed once noted. A 19th century report might describe an echo that behaves strangely, then pivot immediately back to inscriptions or reliefs. The anomaly is acknowledged, then neutralized through neglect. I found that similar descriptions emerge independently. A chamber in Egypt, a temple in South America, an underground structure in South Asia, each produces comparable acoustic responses. These sites share no obvious cultural connection, yet the behaviors recur. This repetition weakens the argument for coincidence. Importantly, the anomalies are not uniform. Each space behaves differently, but within controlled parameters. One room amplifies sustained tone, another dampens sudden sound, a third transfers vibration through stone rather than air. Variation suggests tuning, not accident. I also noticed how modern restoration complicates observation. Floors are reinforced, openings are widened, ceilings are stabilized. These interventions prioritize preservation, but they alter acoustic behavior. In several cases, early visitors describe effects no longer present today. The contradiction is subtle but persistent. If acoustics were incidental, their behavior should be random. Instead, they are consistent enough to be documented, repeated enough to be noticed, and specific enough to provoke physical response. At this stage, the evidence does not demand a conclusion. It only raises tension between expectation and observation. Decorative architecture does not require such precision. Ritual symbolism does not explain frequency selectivity. The official explanation does not fully account for what these spaces do, only for how they look. This is where inquiry shifts. The question is no longer whether these effects exist, but why they appear so regularly and why their implications remain largely unexplored within the accepted framework. I then widened the scope of inquiry because isolated anomalies can be dismissed, but repetition across cultures requires explanation. As I compared temples and stone complexes from Egypt, South America, South Asia, and Europe, I noticed recurring acoustic characteristics embedded within otherwise distinct architectural traditions. Despite differences in iconography and chronology, certain spatial ratios appeared repeatedly. Chambers designed with similar height-to-width proportions produced comparable resonant effects. Long corridors with specific curvature consistently altered sound transmission. Dome-like enclosures, regardless of decorative style, favored low-frequency amplification. Material choice also followed patterns. Dense limestone, granite, and volcanic stone dominate these sites, even where softer materials were available locally. These stones share acoustic properties related to vibration transmission and resonance retention. The selection appears functional, not merely symbolic. In South American temples, particularly those built with polygonal stonework, narrow passages channel sound with unusual clarity. In South Asia, carved stone halls generate sustained reverberation during chanting that does not disperse evenly. In Egypt, enclosed chambers respond strongly to steady tonal input. European subterranean sites exhibit dampening zones that abruptly cancel echo. What matters is not that these effects exist, but that they appear under similar conditions. Geometry, enclosure, and material combine in consistent ways. When one variable changes, the acoustic response changes predictably. This relationship suggests intentional calibration. I found that these similarities are rarely discussed together. Each region is studied in isolation, framed by local religion or culture. Cross-comparison is uncommon, and when it occurs, acoustics are excluded from analysis. This fragmentation obscures broader patterns. The recurrence challenges the assumption of independent invention. While parallel discovery is possible, it usually produces variation and experimentation. Here, the outcomes converge. Different builders arrive at spaces that behave similarly under sound, even when separated by oceans and centuries. Importantly, the patterns do not require advanced machinery. They require knowledge of proportion, material response, and spatial enclosure. These are transferable principles. Once learned, they can be replicated without constant rediscovery. I also noted continuity across time. Later structures often preserve earlier acoustic layouts, even when surface decoration changes. This suggests that certain spatial features were retained deliberately, even as cultural expression evolved. The evidence suggests that sound behavior was recognized, understood, and applied across civilizations. This does not prove a shared origin, but it complicates the idea of coincidence. When patterns repeat across distance and time, they point toward shared knowledge, or at least shared priorities. By this stage, the investigation moves beyond anomaly. The question becomes systemic. If these civilizations repeatedly built spaces that control sound in comparable ways, then acoustics may have been a design consideration operating beneath ritual expression. That possibility leads directly to examining whether these structures functioned as components of a broader system. I became increasingly aware that silence in the record mirrors this repetition. Measurements are absent, diagrams are missing, and terminology is inconsistent. Such gaps appear across regions, suggesting not ignorance but omission. When a feature recurs without explanation, it often signals knowledge assumed, not documented. This pattern does not answer why these spaces exist, but it narrows the field. It suggests builders were not experimenting blindly, but working within constraints already understood. Those constraints, once visible, frame the next stage of inquiry with greater precision and focus.
I approached the question of resonance as a system rather than an individual curiosity, because individual effects only become meaningful when viewed in relation to one another. When multiple structures exhibit controlled vibration, amplification, and dampening, the possibility emerges that these were not standalone features, but coordinated elements of a broader design logic. Resonance is not mystical by default. It is a physical response governed by proportion, material density, enclosure, and input frequency. When these variables are arranged deliberately, sound can be shaped, sustained, or suppressed with remarkable precision. I examined how ancient builders could have understood these principles empirically, through repeated construction and observation, without formal notation surviving. Viewed this way, temples begin to resemble nodes within an acoustic network rather than singular monuments. Each space performs a specific function. One chamber amplifies, another filters, another transfers vibration through stone. Individually, these effects appear anomalous. Together, they suggest modular design, where each architectural component contributes to an overall system behavior. Standardization becomes visible at this level. Certain ratios recur not for symbolism, but because they produce predictable resonance. Passage lengths, ceiling heights, and wall thicknesses align within narrow ranges. These tolerances imply testing and refinement across generations. Knowledge need not be written to be preserved, it can be embedded in practice. I also considered how such systems could be used. Acoustic control affects human perception, coordination, and focus. Sustained low frequencies influence breathing and attention. Rhythmic vibration can synchronize movement or induce altered bodily awareness. The evidence suggests that sound may have been used as an operational medium, not merely as accompaniment. Importantly, system design does not require centralized global planning. Shared principles can propagate through training, apprenticeship, and institutional continuity. Once builders recognize which forms produce desired effects, replication becomes routine. Over time, the system persists, even if its original purpose fades. What remains absent is explicit explanation. There are no surviving manuals detailing acoustic intent, yet results endure in stone. This absence does not negate system design, it characterizes it. Functional knowledge often leaves fewer records than symbolic instruction, especially when it serves administrative or controlled purposes. By framing resonance as a system, the question shifts again. It is no longer whether ancient people noticed sound, but whether they organized architecture to harness it reliably. The evidence suggests they did so repeatedly, with consistency that exceeds ornament or chance. At this stage, the inquiry reaches its center. If temples functioned as acoustic instruments within a broader framework, then their later alteration carries new significance. Understanding why such a system fell silent requires examining not its creation, but its interruption. This perspective reframes restoration, abandonment, and modification as technical acts rather than purely cultural ones. When resonance depends on precision, even minor structural changes can disable function. Blocked passages, altered surfaces, or collapsed ceilings transform instruments into inert spaces. The silence that follows may not reflect loss of belief, but loss of alignment between form, material, and purpose. Such consequences are rarely discussed in official architectural history records. I then turn to the question of silence, because systems do not simply stop functioning without cause. When I examined sites once described as acoustically active, I noticed a recurring pattern of physical disruption that extends beyond natural decay. Structural changes, often labeled as stabilization or restoration, appear repeatedly at points critical to resonance. Blocked chambers are among the most common interventions. Narrow corridors sealed with stone or concrete interrupt airflow and wave propagation. In acoustic systems, even small obstructions alter frequency behavior. When passages are closed, resonance collapses. These blockages are often justified as safety measures, yet their placement consistently neutralizes sound behavior first. Ceiling collapses and reconstructions show similar effects. Many resonant chambers depend on precise ceiling height and curvature. When roofs cave in or are rebuilt with different materials, reflective properties change. I found descriptions from early visitors noting effects that later disappear after repairs. The architecture remains, but its behavior does not. Surface treatments also matter. Polished stone reflects sound differently than roughened or plastered surfaces.
Modern conservation frequently coats walls or fills joints, unintentionally dampening vibration. These choices prioritize visual preservation while disabling acoustic response. I also examined restoration records where original stone was replaced with modern substitutes. Density and elasticity differ even when appearance matches. Acoustic performance depends on these properties. Substitution alters function without altering form, creating the illusion of continuity. Beyond physical alteration, documentation itself fades. Early reports mention sound briefly, then stop. Later surveys omit it entirely. Measurements are absent. Diagrams ignore enclosure ratios. This absence accumulates until silence appears normal. What was once notable becomes invisible through repetition of omission. Political and administrative shifts contribute as well. New regimes inherit structures without inheriting operational knowledge. If resonance served a function tied to prior systems, it may have been deemed irrelevant or disruptive. Deactivation does not require hostility, it requires indifference. Importantly, silence is not evenly distributed. Decorative spaces remain intact. Ceremonial halls are preserved. It is technical spaces that are sealed, altered, or neglected. This uneven treatment suggests selection rather than accident.
The disappearance of records follows the same pattern. Symbolic meaning is documented extensively. Functional behavior is not. This imbalance shapes interpretation. Without records, function becomes speculation. Without function, alteration appears harmless. I found that modern visitors often stand in spaces once described as active, unaware anything is missing. Silence feels natural, yet silence itself is the result of change. Acoustic systems are fragile. They depend on alignment. Once disrupted, they do not degrade gradually, they stop. This realization reframes absence as evidence. When multiple sites lose function in similar ways, explanation shifts from decay to deactivation. Whether intentional or incidental, the result is the same. A system designed to operate through resonance becomes inert, leaving architecture behind without its voice. I concluded by turning toward modern science, not to resolve the mystery, but to clarify its boundaries. Contemporary acoustic engineering has formalized principles that ancient builders appear to have applied empirically. Resonance chambers, waveguides, harmonic amplification, and sound dampening are now modeled mathematically and tested in laboratories. When I compared these principles with ancient structures, the overlap was difficult to ignore. Modern concert halls use precise ratios to control reverberation time. Underground research facilities isolate vibration through material density and geometry. Even medical imaging relies on controlled resonance interacting with human tissue. These systems are complex, but their foundations are simple: proportion, material response, and enclosure shape. Ancient temples exhibit these same variables arranged with comparable sensitivity. Neuroscience adds another layer. Sustained low-frequency sound is known to influence attention patterns, breathing patterns, and emotional regulation. Vibrational exposure can alter perception without conscious awareness. These effects are measurable today, yet their historical implications remain understudied. When ancient chambers produce sensations similar to those now documented in laboratories, it raises a question about intent. What remains unexplained is not capability, but continuity. Modern systems require documentation, calibration, and institutional memory. Ancient systems appear to have operated without leaving explicit manuals. This does not imply absence of knowledge, only absence of records that survived disruption. I noticed that when modern researchers encounter ancient acoustic effects, they often isolate them as curiosities. Studies focus on one chamber, one frequency, one sensation. Rarely are these findings integrated into broader architectural interpretation. The compartmentalization mirrors earlier academic patterns. The persistence of unanswered questions may stem from disciplinary boundaries.
Archaeology prioritizes material culture. Engineering prioritizes reproducibility. Neuroscience prioritizes controlled environments. Ancient resonant temples fall between these fields. No single discipline claims full responsibility for interpreting them. There is also discomfort with ambiguity. Functional explanations invite further inquiry, while symbolic explanations close discussion. Without definitive proof, many researchers default to caution. This caution is understandable, but it has consequences. Questions remain unasked because answers are uncertain. I found that modern technology confirms possibility, not purpose. We can replicate resonance effects. We can measure physiological response. What we cannot reconstruct easily is the social framework that gave these systems meaning. Without context, function remains incomplete. This investigation does not argue that ancient temples were laboratories, nor that they served a single unified purpose. It suggests only that their acoustic behavior aligns with principles now recognized as powerful and precise. That alignment deserves attention rather than dismissal. The silence that surrounds these structures today is not merely physical, it is interpretive. When evidence does not fit established categories, it is often set aside. Yet unanswered questions persist precisely because they touch on limits of understanding. As I stepped back from the evidence, the inquiry remained open. Ancient resonant temples stand between architecture and science, ritual and function, memory and omission. They continue to respond to sound, even if their original purpose no longer responds to us. The question is not whether they matter, but whether we are prepared to listen carefully enough to what they still imply.